Welcome, friends of the Greasy Shop Rag. Today we're going to take a look at a Husqvarna 235 chainsaw. The customer complaint is that he noticed the fuel filter was laying loose in the bottom of the tank. You can see he's got the filter taped to the top of the cylinder cover. He doesn't know how long he's been running it this way, but it's been acting up a little bit lately, so he suspects it may have been off of there for a while. And in such a case, we would suspect that there might be some dirt inside the carburetor. Either way, we need to go through the steps of replacing the fuel line, or all the fuel lines. And in that process, we'll be removing the carburetor, so we'll take a peek in there as well. Before I do any of that, I always look in the cylinder and make sure that this is a worthy project and not a scored cylinder type of engine where repair costs could become excessive. But we looked in there and the cylinder looked good, so we're going to move forward. So looks like the customer does some maintenance here. There's not a bunch of dirt under the hood. It's got a new air filter on it. I was babbling too much to see what the spark plug looked like, but I think we threaded it back in there, didn't we? When he flips it over, we'll take another look. So we got to remove the handle to get the carburetor off, and there's 3 screws that hold this handle in place. You'll notice that I'm separating some long screws from short screws. You need to be conscious of where those go. So there is a throttle rod that's hooked into the trigger lever. This is not the right way to do this, but this is the way I do every one of them. You really should take that handle apart and disconnect that linkage so you're not bending anything. I don't know. I've been doing it like that a long time and haven't had any problems. But every time I take one of these handles off, I check these screws because the relationship between the front handle and the rear grip is usually a little sloppy, where it goes from gray to orange there on the handle. Those screws get loose. So I always tighten them up. Now there is a little bit of a plate that lives behind the carburetor that the throttle rod goes through. There's a single screw holding it in place. We'll just remove that screw and remove that plate. So now what we're looking at is basically typical access to a carburetor. We can easily get on this one long screw and the 2 8mm sized nuts that hold that air filter base in place. There's one of them. We'll get the other one off of here. There we go. So now we can remove the air filter base. Push that off to the side. That also has a stop switch on it. This blue lever is for our choke. Throttle rod is on the other side. So as we're pulling this apart, we're noticing that the return fuel line is off of there. The suction line from the primer to the carburetor is pretty brown. This other fuel line that came out of the tank just broke off. And our gasket is busted. So it's a good thing we took this apart because there's a lot going on here. So to replace the fuel lines, I always cut off more line than I'm going to need. And then in this case, you can see I put a pretty sharp taper on the end of that line. Probably a good inch of taper cut on the end so that I could push a bulk of that line through the hole in the top of the tank. And then I'll be able to reach through the end of the tank and grab that line easier. Alright, we got that line started. Now, like I said, we're going to reach through and pull that line through the tank. And then once it's through, we got to cut that taper off the end. So we'll just flush cut it. And we're going to put his filter back. Is that his filter? Oh, I don't even know. Well, we're going to put a fuel filter on it. I think that's a new one. There we go. Drop that in the tank, and then we're going to kind of adjust the amount of line that's actually in the tank. I want that filter to lay on the bottom of the tank. Now looking at the carburetor, we kind of want to put it back in place and then measure the length of line we need here. So I'm just kind of putting it where it would go on the carb and then flush cutting the line. So we got that one set. And then we have a return line that goes from the long stem on the primer bulb to a hole in the top of the tank. And again, I'm going to cut a long angle on the end of that fuel hose and push it in through the bottom, or push it in through the top of the tank. This one's a little bit more of a reach to get at. And it's dark down in there, so I'll just drop the flashlight in and then reach in and grab that line. Looks like we got a hold of it. And I pulled it through and I'm flush cutting it. Now that's more line than I need in the bottom of that tank, so I'm just going to pull the slack out of here. And I'm going to leave a good inch or so sticking through the top of the tank. Now I can measure the length I need to run up over where the carb would be to the long stem of the primer bulb. We can push it right on there. We can always adjust the length of that later. In fact, I already decided that it was too long, so we'll cut a little bit more off. Alright, now there's one more line. This one's on the carburetor. That one was on there pretty darn good. But we got it off. And we can use that line to measure our replacement line. I add a little bit of length to it. You know, you can always make them shorter. And I figured them old lines, they shrink a little bit too, so. Now we got both our lines on the primer bulb. That leaves us with a line that goes from the primer to the carb and then from the tank to the carb. So because that fuel filter was off of there and we don't know how long you ran it that way, I want to open this thing up and take a look at the micro screen in the carb. See if there's any dirt in there. There's the micro screen. And it did have dirt in it. So it's a good thing we opened it up. Now, this isn't another carb rebuild video. So I'm just going to buzz through this. And while he's messing around with that carburetor, I want to talk to you about a YouTube channel that I watch. It's called Tony's Lawn Care. And Tony, he's a viewer here, and I watch his channel. And he mentioned in the comments section that he does podcasts, and he'd like to have me on as a guest. So Tony and I, we did that interview, and it's on his channel. I'll put a link in the description of this video on how to get to that podcast. I know, some people like podcasts. This is the first time I ever did a podcast interview, and it actually went kind of long. But if that's something that you're interested in, or if you want to find out a little bit more about your host here on this channel, then I encourage you to check it out. So it looks like we went through the carburetor and we put a kit in it. We cleaned out the micro screen, or maybe we replaced it. I don't know. I was babbling about Tony's channel. But either way, the micro screen is clean now, and we have a new metering diaphragm and a new fuel pump in there. We attach the fuel lines to the carburetor, We have the choke rod on the carburetor. Now we're installing the throttle rod. Make sure you do this now because you can't do it later. You'll have to take it all apart again if you want to do it later. There we go. We got that throttle rod hooked in there, and you can see how there just isn't enough clearance to do it with the carb mounted. Here is our air filter base plate. We have the choke lever tucked in underneath the red stop switch. And then we'll just install our two 8mm nuts and our one long screw that goes through there as well. So this whole job, I think you're looking at about a 15-minute video, and I think I started with 30 minutes of footage before I started editing. So we're talking about a half-an-hour job to do the fuel lines and refresh the carburetor. And that's what the customer will get, is a half-an-hour labor plus parts. I'm trying to see if I left his fuel filter on the bench or if I used a new one. I still haven't quite figured that out. Maybe if you were following along you noticed whether or not I did. His old air filter was good, so we'll put that on. It almost looks like he had some running issues and he tried to fix them by putting a new filter on there, but obviously that didn't help when the fuel filter was off inside the tank. So this system just uses this metal shroud and a single screw to hold that felt filter in place. And then this is a step that I sometimes forget, but this cover has to go back on now before we move forward. There's been many a time that I've had to take the handle back off of one of these just to install this cover because, you know, sometimes you forget. But I don't want you to forget, so that's all I'm telling you. We got the cover in place. A single screw will hold it on. Sometimes this is a Phillips screw, sometimes it's a Torx screw. Throttle rod looks good. We're going to tighten this handle. I think I may have hit the Torx screw when I took it off, but there's also a couple of 7mm nuts that got to be tightened up. So there's the hole in the trigger lever, and then you can see the loop in the throttle rod. You just got to hook the loop into the hole. There we go. And then we can put it together. Now we have those 3 screws. And one of them goes here on this anti-vibe spring. And now we're going to grab, which one, the long one or the short one? Grab the short one and put it in the back. And the long one in the front. The reason for that is you don't want that long screw in the back and you reach up and poke through the bottom of the fuel tank. Alright, we're getting ready to put some fuel in here and some oil and do a test run. And if it starts and runs decent, we may have to tweak the carb. But if it does run, then that's all I'm going to have for you on the Husqvarna 235 chainsaw that needed some new fuel lines and a carburetor refresh. Thanks for watching. Later. Oh, that primes up nice now. wonder if he messed with it when it wouldn't run right.